Welcome to Season 5 of the Agile Brand with Greg Kihlstrom, where we talk with enterprise and technology platform leaders about the people, processes, and platforms that make marketing and customer experience successful, scalable, and sustainable. This is what creates an Agile brand. I'm your host, Greg Kihlstrom, advisor and consultant for Fortune 1000 marketing and CX leaders and teams as principal and chief strategist at GK5A, and best-selling author, keynote speaker, entrepreneur, and Agile certified coach. The Agile Brand podcast is brought to you by TEKsystems, an industry leader in full-stack technology services, talent services, and real-world application. For more information, go to teksystems.com. To sign up for the Agile Brand newsletter and get the latest insights and articles on marketing technology and CX, or to purchase a copy of my latest book, House of the Customer, go to gregkihlstrom.com. You can also find all my books on Amazon and other retailers. And now on to the show. Today we're going to talk about maintaining a great employee experience during tough economic times and maintaining morale when teams are stretched thin and often with higher expectations. To help me discuss this topic, I'd like to welcome Anne Jacoby, founder and CEO at the Spring Street Solutions Company. Anne, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here, Greg. Thank you.
Yeah, looking forward to talking about this topic with you. I know we've had several chats about similar topics, and glad the audience is going to be able to listen in here. So why don't we start by you giving a little background on yourself as well as how you work with companies.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So I like to say that I'm on a mission to cultivate more creativity at work. And that's probably because of my unconventional background. I started my career as a singer, actor, dancer. But for the past 20 plus years, I've been in business, scaling companies as an operator and a leader of learning, development, and culture. And now I partner with organizations to help them strategically build the workplace cultures that they crave.
Great. So let's dive in here and let's get started by talking about the employee experience during tough economic times. I mean, the last several years we've seen a lot of things going. I mean, in my career, I've seen a few of these upturns, downturns, all this as well as I'm sure many of us have. But these recent times, there's also some unique things about them. So, from an employee perspective, they have it tough when economic conditions are poor. They're often part of teams that become short-staffed and saddled with too much work because there's either layoffs or hiring freezes. And this can cause morale or productivity issues. So as a leader, what's the first thing you should do when you're going to be challenged like this? Because, you can't change the economy, right? But, what can you do with your teams?
Oh, I love this question. And I'm glad that you pointed out that it is a cycle, right? This isn't going to last forever. But yes, times are getting kind of tough right now. And I think as a leader, it's really important to be crystal clear about what the priorities are and communicate them early and often, and also limit them, right? It's so easy to kind of have eyes bigger than our stomachs. We want to do all the things, but now is the time to really dial into what are the, say, 2 to 3 things that are really going to move the needle on the business and focus there. Make sure that the team is super aligned and clear. But I'll also add, because I am in this creativity focus and space, that it's really important to still be creative, allow the time to be creative and experiment so that you don't lose the innovation that's really going to help your company to survive these tough times and ideally actually thrive in them.
Yeah. And so, given, hiring freezes, layoffs, budget cuts, on top of those things, the term investment is kind of a bad word in these times, but to your point, we still need to keep the employees engaged that are there. So what are some good investments that leaders can make in their teams even when times are tough?
Yeah, well, I'll preface this by saying I'm slightly biased, but I do think that the first thing to invest in is coaching. I mean, executive coaches, coaching across your team, targeted areas to really help upskill your future leaders yields dividends. So that would be a big thing to start with. I also think skill building and learning and development. So it's really easy for these things to get cut, especially in downturns, but gosh, if you invest, it doesn't have to be super expensive, right? It can be an informal book club or even just listening to podcasts like these to kind of upskill your team and build that shared learning community can really be a great way to give back. And it doesn't have to be super high cost.
Yeah.
And then the third thing that comes to mind is just this concept of social connection. I see a lot of organizations finally bringing their teams together. There's nothing like sharing a meal together to build relationships and bonds, but that can also be done remotely. Just dedicating a little bit of time for social connection, getting to know each other. It can be on new platforms like Twine, where I'm an advisor, full disclosure, or Donut and Slack. Just ways to find these micro moments of connection can really be a great investment in team building.
Yeah. I love all of those ideas. You mentioned earlier about prioritizing and just how that's important, and leaders need to be able to do that. So, but also employees need to be able to communicate some of those things as well. So how can members of a team work with their leaders to set realistic goals and outcomes during times like this? C-level leadership may have certain expectations they need to hold the company to. And so, they've got their priorities. How can a great employee not get lost between mismatched expectations?
Yeah. Well, goal setting is a big passion of mine. I'm a bit of a goal setting junkie. I love them.
Yeah.
But it can often be intimidating or demoralizing to team members, like you mentioned, kind of getting lost or feeling this sense of disconnection from what does the company really care about? What does the team really care about? And so I think there's real power in having shared team goals that are really well connected to the organization's top priorities. I personally really like the OKR model, the objectives and key results, because it helps to sharpen the focus on measurement. Really, how are we going to measure this and say that it's true, that it really happened? But also because OKRs are designed to be done quarterly. It's not kind of set your goals for the year and forget about them. We all know that the speed of business is so fast nowadays. It really takes that monitoring every few months to make sure that you're on the right track, that you're focused on the right activities that are really helping to fuel the company. So I like that kind of design.
Yeah. And so you mentioned a little bit ago, some when we're talking about the investments, that interactions are really key. And so, I wanted to follow up on that and talk about in-person interactions. I mean, a lot of companies, they've moved to either fully remote or hybrid. And, really, I've worked with global companies for quite a while. They've, in a sense, always been remote, although, there were in-person meetings and stuff like that. But, when we were prepping for the show, we talked a bit about just how valuable in-person interactions can be when they're done well. So, can you talk a little bit more about this and how, offsite meetings or other things like that can be a really valuable thing for teams that may rarely work together in person?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's interesting. I think about my theater background and how much that influences how I approach the design of these offsite interactions. It's really like building a production in many ways. You've got the stage, you've got to have the right environment, you've got to design this user experience. One of my big pet peeves for offsites is, people standing up in front of the room and then they just share their slide deck as if, it could have been a Zoom meeting, right? You really need to fly everyone in for that kind of interaction. And so what a great opportunity to build role plays, to build cross-functional breakouts, to connect people who don't normally connect so that they can build this muscle of seeking out and sharing these different perspectives. So that's really how I approach it. And that's really where I see a lot of the learning and insights come from.
Before we continue, I'd like to introduce you to a sponsor of the show, Basecamp. Throughout my career, whether it was at my own agency or now as a consultant, Basecamp is what we rely on to help keep projects on track, on schedule, and on budget. It takes a straightforward approach to project management, it streamlines workflow management, and definitely keeps the team in the loop and on top of ongoing updates, which all are major components in a smooth-running operation. No matter if it's a simple campaign or a multi-million-dollar project, Basecamp has been a key ingredient in the recipe for a successful project and business. If you're struggling with projects, sign up for Basecamp. Their pricing is simple and they give you all their features in a single plan. No upsells, no upgrades. Go to basecamp.com/agile. That's basecamp.com/AGILE and try Basecamp for free. No credit card required and cancel anytime. Thank you, Basecamp, for sponsoring this episode. Now let's get back to the show.
Any other, tips to make these these offsites most effective for these teams? Like, how do you make sure that it's is there an OKR there? Is there some kind of measure of success of an expectation there?
Yeah, well, I'm a big fan. It's such a great question. I'm a big fan of getting input from the team in advance so that you're really designing something that is custom built for what they want, right? Some teams are really going to want focus on planning. We really need to plan. We don't do enough planning. Other teams, it's more about social connection. They want to have lots of fun, engaging activities that maybe get them out of their comfort zone. So, taking the temperature, if you will, of the team and understanding what they want to get out of the experience really helps to purpose build something that meets the needs of where that team is at that moment. And that's going to change over time. So big fan of the pre-survey, pre-offsite survey. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. So one last topic I wanted to talk about with you, and that's culture assessments. And I've experienced some of these, and to great success as well. And always find them insightful. And can you talk a little bit about what exactly, for those that are less familiar, maybe they've received one, but they don't really see what goes into it or the end results even. But can you talk a little bit about exactly what a culture assessment is and some of the questions that these assessments can help answer?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. So this tends to be one of Spring Street's more popular product offerings today. And I think maybe that's a result of, like you stated earlier, Greg, people are redefining how they work together. They've either shifted to hybrid or they're global teams, and now they're even more distributed than they were before. There's a lot of movement and redesigning of the employee experience. And so with our assessments, we typically build custom surveys, listening tours, really to get to the heart of what people value most in their work environment. We're trying to kind of put our finger on the pulse of, okay, what matters? What are those moments that matter across the organization? What contributes the most to belonging? And where are there potential gaps to what we think our culture is and what it actually is? So defining those gaps, figuring out the roadmap to get there. And then ideally delivering an insights report at the end that creates a true pathway to create a stronger culture in whatever form that means to that particular client, because it isn't one size fits all. So that's really important. And I know we've talked a lot about the employee experience right now, feeling the downturn of the market, but gosh, it is still super low unemployment. I'd say it's still very much an employee's market. So co-creating this exceptional culture is probably the number one way to attract and retain that top talent.
Yeah. Yeah. What about some of the outcomes that a culture assessment can help organizations achieve? So, when you do one of these, I know every organization is different, but at a high level, like what can someone expect that they're going to get from it and be able to do with it?
Yeah. Well, we try to celebrate the good, right? What's working really well? Let's make sure that we do more of that we don't change behaviors that are already yielding to great results. So that's one thing that we do. But then where there are gaps or where there are opportunities, I'll call them, for improvement, that typically translates to strategy and initiatives that can help evolve the culture in a more positive direction. So it might mean, okay, we need some leadership training over here. This pocket of the organization isn't getting really high scores. Or we might see an opportunity to, gosh, we got to double down on our organizational purpose because people don't really know what they're working on and why it matters. So that might be an initiative to embrace. So again, yeah, you're right. It depends on the organization. It depends on the scale and the size and where there are opportunities, but it typically yields a roadmap for initiatives and a prioritized strategy.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, one more question on this, actually. So, are there often, are there anything that companies are often surprised about when they get the results from, again, I know there's probably different things for different companies, but, do you see any themes of things that either good or bad, but, often kind of catch people off guard?
Yeah. I think where you start to see some trends is, gosh, as the leader, it can often feel like you're communicating a lot, but it doesn't always land. And I think noticing that, well, gosh, this message that I really thought I was being clear about in all of our all hands communications, and we followed up here, but it's just not connecting. And so that's often a surprising disconnect where leaders feel like, well, gosh, I feel like I've been talking about it, but it's just for whatever reason, it's not the right channel or format, or it's just not frequent enough to really capture the attention of very busy employees that, are overwhelmed and exhausted, and many of them, approaching burnout. It's got to be a slightly different approach, especially in our more fragmented attention world that we live in.
So one more question. You do an exercise called North Star, and I'd love to hear a little bit about that and how you work with companies to achieve great results with it.
Yeah, absolutely, Greg. So, one of the things I was talking about was organizational purpose, just as a way of example of, what might be lacking and what people feel, disconnected from. So North Star is really a way to align leaders and culture carriers and people across the organization to really understand the organizational purpose and the heartbeat of the organization. So this North Star is the guiding light across the company. And then, there's usually a sequence where we start there, and then we go into the vision, the what of the organization. What do you want to be? How are you different from all other organizations in your category? Then we get into the mission, which is the how. How are we going to get this done? And the mission might evolve over time, right? Your strategy might change, or your service offerings or product offerings might change. And then we get into values. And I just love spending time on defining core values with organizational leaders, but then also figuring out how to activate them and bring them to life. And that involves a lot of storytelling, a lot of, spotting what does good look like in our behaviors and how we show up for each other. There's so much misunderstanding about what culture really is. And it's this adopted social norms and behaviors and language that a group of people adopt and kind of embrace. And so if you can get to the heart of those things, all wrapped within the North Star, I've seen organizations really transform how they show up for each other and clarify who they want to be, which is why we all come to work.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's great. Well, Anne, thanks so much for joining the show. I've got one last question before we wrap up here. You've given a lot of great advice already, but what's one last piece of advice that you would have for leaders that are managing teams through these challenging economic times as they navigate the months ahead?
Yeah. So I'll borrow this from Dan Pink, and it's more why, less how. And it was so true during the pandemic. It remains really true today. Leaning into the why of your organization really makes a big difference. So rather than worry about all the nuts and bolts, the micromanaging techniques of how we're going to get this done, really focusing on why we're doing what we're doing, why we're coming together to build this organization is a great place to start. And it's all about being purposeful, being personal, and showing up as humans. So conduct those stay interviews with your team, recognize and appreciate them for all they're doing. People really are working hard, but it's really time to go back to the why. And speaking of appreciation, I wanted to thank you, Greg, for inviting me to be on your show. It's been a blast.
Yeah. Always great to talk with you. Again, I'd like to thank Anne Jacoby, founder and CEO of the Spring Street Solutions Company, for joining the show. You can learn more about Anne and the Spring Street Solutions Company by following the links in the show notes. Talk with you next week.
Thanks again for listening to the Agile Brand with Greg Kihlstrom podcast, brought to you by Tech Systems. If you enjoyed the show, please take a minute to subscribe on your podcast channel of choice and leave us a rating so that others can find the show more easily. You can access more episodes of the show at www.gregkihlstrom.com. That's KIHLSTROM.com. To get a copy of my latest book, House of the Customer, visit my website, or you can find it on Amazon or other retailers. The Agile brand is produced by Missing Link, a Latina-owned, strategy-driven, creatively fueled production co-op. From ideation to creation, they craft human connections through intelligent, engaging, and informative content. Until next time, stay agile.